Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we're going to be going over and showing you how to install the Demco towed vehicle conversion kit. So our conversion kit is going to allow us to adapt a vehicle that has an Air Force One supplemental braking system installed to be used with a stay-in-place supplemental braking system. Now it's pretty simple in regards to the differences between the two. The Air Force One is going to be designed for motorhomes that have air brakes, whereas the stay-in-play is going to be designed for motorhomes that have normal hydraulic brakes, just like your vehicle. So most likely, the reason that you're looking at this conversion kit is because you previously had a motorhome with air brakes, but you now have a new motorhome with hydraulic brakes. We can't actually use the Air Force One braking system on motorhomes with hydraulic brakes, which is why you need the conversion kit to transfer over to the stay-in-play so you can still use part of your supplemental braking system and you can still effectively tow your vehicle with your new motorhome without having to purchase an entire new system. So something else I really like about this kit is Demco has made it very simple. This is the only thing we're going to need to transfer everything over. We don't have to worry about piecing together all these separate parts. This complete kit is going to have everything we need to make the swap. So in regards to installation, this one is actually not too bad at all. One of the more challenging things with these braking systems, the stay-in-play or the Air Force One, at least that I struggle with most, and that's going to be mounting the anchor point to the firewall for the actuator and then adjusting that on the brake pedal. Thankfully, we're not going to have to do that because we're going to be able to reuse the existing. Therefore, pretty much all we're going to be doing is routing some lines and attaching some wires. It's all fairly simple, and we can walk you through this entire process step by step now. Keep in mind, the vehicle we're going to be installing it on is this Jeep Grand Cherokee, but this is going to be more of a generic installation, so therefore the exact process and steps in regards to the component locations can vary for your particular setup. So before we start our installation, we have to remove a few of the existing components. So two things in particular we need to remove, and that's going to be the operating unit, which is what we have here. Now, granted, this is the older Air Force operating unit. The newer one is a little bit of a thinner profile, so it may look a little bit different, but not to worry, the installation and removal procedure will be pretty much the same. So we first need to locate this, and then we're going to remove it. So how we remove it, we're going to have two wires coming from this. We're simply going to clip those wires. We have two Airline fittings here. These are push to connect fittings. We'll simply push in on the Airline, hold down that collar, pull out, and then we have a vacuum fitting that we just took a pair of tubing cutters and we cut that off. So the removal of this is pretty much going to vary depending on where the previous owner installed this. Our particular unit was mounted over on the passenger side in the engine bay, up in that pocket there. But once we have that removed, there's one other thing we need to remove. Now you can leave this in place if you want, but I chose to go ahead and remove it. So this is the port that connects to the tow vehicle via the umbilical cord. So this gets mounted on the front of the vehicle. We have the Schrader valve there. So for our particular application, this customer had it mounted to the electrical connector bracket. So this simply unscrews there, and then we can remove it out the back side. So the Airline here that went to this valve, this was actually plugged in to one of the ports here on our operating unit. So you can go ahead and pull the rest of the Airline tubing out with this valve here. So now we're ready to install our new operating unit. We're going to be installing it in the same place that our old one came out, just because that's where all of our wires and lines are already ran. So we want to be able to utilize those connections to make our installation simpler. So here you can see we have our new operating unit in place. So basically how the old owner had this mounted is, so there's a flange on each side of this with 4 pre-drilled holes in that flange, and we have a zip tie through each of those holes in the flange, and it's actually secured to the factory wiring harness that's ran right here through the PCM. So it's actually pretty solid mounting here. Now you're probably going to want some longer zip ties for those bottom 2 holes there, but essentially we're just tying each of the 4 sides off to the factory wiring harness behind here. As you can see, it is pretty solid, so this isn't really a bad mounting location. So once we have the unit mounted, we can make 2 connections right off the bat. We shouldn't have to run any lines for this. So here is the vacuum port that we removed from the old operating unit, and here's one of the 2 Airline tubes that we removed from the old operating unit as well. So if you're not sure which Airline tubing went where, one of these was going to be running to the front of the vehicle, that's to that Schrader valve that we removed. The other one should be running inside the vehicle to the brake pedal where we have our actuator mounted. So the one that's running inside of the vehicle to our actuator, that's the one we're going to be reusing. We'll simply just press that into the Airline fitting on the top of the operating unit here. So now we need to go ahead and take care of our wiring. So we're going to have 4 wires coming from our new operating unit. We're going to set the red and the black ones aside. We'll show you those connections later. But as far as the brown and the blue one goes, the blue one is pretty simple. So the blue wire that we cut free from the old operating unit, we should still have sitting in here. That's going to be this end of that wire. All we did was we took a butt connector and simply attached it to the blue wire coming from the operating unit. That blue wire actually goes to our breakaway switch. So we did actually cut some excess off. You're going to have plenty of extra. The brown wire, however, we actually need to use that. We're going to be running that down to the breakaway switch as well. Now the best way to get there is just to follow the route that the blue wire was ran from the previous installer. It actually comes down through here, and then down in this area here it just goes straight down. We'll show you the connection underneath in a minute, but what that brown wire does is that's going to be splicing into the other wire from our breakaway switch. So we're going to have 2 wires going to our breakaway switch, an orange wire and a blue wire. The blue wire comes up here, goes to the blue wire on the operating unit. The orange wire is going to connect to our brown wire down underneath, and then it's going to tee in and splice and run over to the battery and hook up to the battery with a circuit breaker or fuse holder in between. So again, we'll show you that connection in a second. One other thing I do want to make note of is that if you're using a monitor light, you will have to splice into the breakaway wires and run those into the cab of the vehicle. Now this particular customer, they didn't have one installed previously, and the kit doesn't come with one, so unless you're going to be reusing your old one, you'd go ahead and hook those wires up, but if not, the unit will still work without it. So if we come to the front of the vehicle here, we can see our breakaway switch. This is where the previous owner chose to mount it, or the previous installer rather. And as we said, there's going to be 2 wires coming from it, an orange wire and then a blue wire. So that blue wire went up to the blue wire on the operating unit. Here is the brown wire that came down from the operating unit, and you can see we have it spliced in line with the orange wire. The other side of this orange wire should already be ran. That should be going up to the battery with a circuit breaker in between, or rather a fuse holder with fuse. So next we're going to be mounting our Geforce controller. So this is going to be mounted inside the vehicle here. We're going to mount it in this location here. There's simply going to be a self-tapping screw on either side that just screws into this panel. And you can see we have our wiring harness. We actually taped ours together to make things a little bit less clutter. But what we're going to do now is we're going to find a grommet in the firewall there that we can feed our wires through up into the engine bay. So in order to get your wiring harness up into the engine bay, you should already have some sort of grommet or pass-through that we can use. If you find where the Airline tube that comes in and attaches to the cylinder, if you find where they spliced into the vehicle with that, you can easily use that same hole to run your wires out of. For our particular application, there's going to be a smaller grommet located right under here. We simply just sort of opened up the grommet a little bit more as best we could with the screwdriver, and then we slid the rest of our wires through that and pulled them up into the engine bay. So here's where our wires are going to come out. You're going to have 5 total wires, yellow, white, green, and then you're going to have the red and black. So what we need to do at this point here, you can see I've already got some wire loom, but we're going to be separating the red and black wires. I'm going to use some of the wire loom that comes in our kit here because we're going to be routing this over the passenger side, and these are going to attach to the black and red wires coming from our operating unit. And we'll set these 3 wires aside for installation here later. So we're going to go ahead and route these wires up over the engine here, tying it to some existing lines that we already have ran, and then we'll hook it up to the operating unit. So now that we have our black and red wires ran over here to the operating unit, you're again going to go ahead and cut off your extra slack. But now we'll just peel back some of the jacket and attach them to one another using the butt connectors provided in your kit. So granted, yours are going to look a little bit different than the ones we're using. We're actually using heat shrink butt connectors. We do sell these here at eTrailer if you want to pick them up, but again, the ones that come in your kit are going to work fine. If you are using the heat shrink butt connectors, you're going to make sure that you go ahead and seal them up with a heat gun. And we also just like to tape them up with electrical tape as well, just to make sure everything is nice and solid. And now to finish up, we have our 3 remaining wires that came from the Geforce controller. So these wires here are actually going to splice in line with our diode wiring. So in order to use this kit, you do need to have some sort of integrated wiring in the vehicle. You can't use any magnetic lights with this. So the installation process for these wires is really going to vary depending on how the previous installer ran the wires from the front to the rear. What we're going to do is we're going to splice in just directly behind the trailer connector, because that's the easiest way to find those wires. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some of the included wire loom in our kit here. I'm going to cover these wires, and then I'm going to run them down along the fender here over until I can go straight down around where our trailer connector is. So now you can see we have our 3 wires routed towards the front of the vehicle where we have our trailer connector mounted. This is where the previous installer installed theirs. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the wires from behind the trailer connector. We should see this bonded 4-pole here. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to tie these 3 wires into the 3 wires that correspond to the correct colors from this harness here, using the butt connectors provided in our kit. Now we do actually need to make an additional ground in line with the diodes in the wires coming from the Geforce controller. However, I think we're going to go back up top and do that after we finish this, because there isn't really a good spot down here to create that additional ground. But now we can just splice our wires in like we already know how. So now you can see we have our connections made. I just simply spliced in between all of these wires, and then I cut the white, yellow, and green that we'll be using. You can see all the connections are made. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and seal all those up with a heat gun, and then we're going to tape everything up nice and good, make sure we have all of our wire loom back on, and then tuck those wires back behind the bumper there. But as said, now the last thing we need to do is we need to create an additional ground in line on that white wire. We'll go back up into the engine bay and we'll show you that next. So here's what our additional ground looks like. So if we look directly behind by the battery and then the fuse box here, we're going to see an existing ground stud. So you're going to take an 8mm socket, you're going to loosen up that stud, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take the white wire from the 3 wires that came from the Geforce controller. We're going to split that in half. One end goes to a butt connector, the other end is going to go to the other end of the wire coming from the controller, and then we actually have an additional lead here that we splice into that as well. So there's 2 wires on this end, 1 on this end, and then we just simply used a ring terminal to secure it to this existing ground stud. But now we're ready to go ahead and test our system to make sure everything's working properly, and if it is, then we can go ahead and seal up all our connections using electrical tape and a heat gun. So in order to test this system, we're going to want to pull the breakaway switch, and then we'll come inside the vehicle here. We'll just simply flip on the Geforce controller. As we can see, the actuator is engaging, so we know everything was hooked up correctly. And that's going to do it today for our look and installation of the Demco towed vehicle conversion kit.